The title of this talk is Neither Unionism nor Nationalism, and I'll just start by indicating a problem with a talk like this. Anytime you give a talk at Marxism on the North, you have to encompass everything. So you have to talk about nationalism, you have to talk about unionism, we're going to have to talk about a lot of other things. And you always have somebody in the bar afterwards who says, it was a good talk, but you didn't really mention loyalism, did you? You didn't talk about republicanism, you didn't talk about... So, I have a broad scope of things that I want to touch on. Obviously, people's level of understanding of the North is also uneven in the room, so I'll do my best to try and give people the best overview of the situation in the North and how we as socialists understand it. The title itself obviously is Neither Unionism nor Nationalism, which is echoes a comment made by Jerry Carroll, who was elected as a councillor in May of this year for People Before Profit. And this was a very significant election. It was the first socialist to be elected in Belfast in decades. He was elected very comfortably, only 100 votes from topping the poll. And it wasn't, if it wasn't a major political earthquake, it was at least an event whose reverberations were felt certainly within the main political parties in the North. So this, I think, was a very significant event. And obviously the day after in the press, Jerry was asked to sum up his politics, and he says, I'm neither a unionist nor a nationalist, I'm a socialist. Now, the first thing to say about that statement, no criticism to Jerry, is, right, neither unionist nor nationalist, but I'm a socialist. But what does that mean? What does that mean in the context of the North? Because I don't think that's immediately, I don't think people immediately understand that. And then how does a socialist relate to those two things? How does a socialist relate to unionism? How does a socialist relate to nationalism? So I think what I'm going to try and do in this talk is to try and pull out some of those questions, to understand how we look at unionism and nationalism as political ideologies, how a socialist relates to both of them, and what the prospects are for building a left in the North. Okay, now the other thing to say about that statement from Jerry is that it might seem like a very generic comment to make. It might seem like, well, all right, you're not a nationalist, you're not a unionist, you're a socialist, so what? But actually, in the context of politics in the North, it's a very radical thing to say, because the entire political system in the North is formed on the basis that there are two political blocs, unionism and nationalism, whose basis is enshrined into the system. It's not like, for instance, the two main parties in London or the Tories and the Labour Party, but it's not enshrined into the state, or the Civil War parties in the South. It's not enshrined that you're either a Fianna Fáil or you're a Fine Gael or whatever. So that idea, that understanding of there being two traditions, two ideologies, is very deep in the North, and it's reflected in the state itself. So to actually come out and say, well, I don't stand in this, is a very radical thing to say. In fact, as soon as you say, well, I'm not a unionist or a nationalist, I'm a socialist, well, then people begin to ask, well, are you a national socialist, or are you a unionist socialist, or what are you? Are you a dissident, are you a loyalist, are you whatever? Labels can be quite important in the North. It's not in the South. When you stand for election, people ask you constantly, what are you? How do you define yourself? How do you define Fianna Fáil? How do you define Fine Gael? There's no labels. It's not instantly applicable what the labels, bastards maybe, but it's not instantly applicable what the label is. But in the North, labels are important. What are you? And of course, the term socialist is something that people have some general understanding of, but the tradition of socialism is not known in terms of the North. And I think what we're doing here in the North, and what maybe we want to try and pull out here today, is to explain what that tradition actually means. Now, first of all, in terms of the two ideologies that we're talking about, Jerry Kelly said, who's a Sinn Féin MLA from North Belfast, said that there are two traditions in the North, each equally valid, which in itself is a contradiction. And all we can sort of hope for is that we learn from each other, we don't fight amongst each other, and we have these two traditions. The understanding of that comes from this idea that nationalism and unionism are essentially natural, are natural reflections of people's quote-unquote identity or nationality or whatever way you want to put it. That in other words, you're born a Catholic, so you're a nationalist. You're born a Protestant, you're a Unionist, and no real change can come within that. That is how the system understands it. Now we would reject that. We reject this idea that Unionism or nationalism are simple reflections of nationality or identity, and much more importantly, we reject the idea that they can't be challenged. In terms of unionism itself, I mean, unionism is the historic ruling ideology, if you like, in the North. Obviously, the state, when it was set up in the 20s, was set up with a unionist majority. It was a movement that actually emerged in the first place as a movement to basically stop or to fight against the emergence of the United Irishmen and the revolutionary upheavals of that time. And it is, in essence, a very conservative and very, quite reactionary ideology in the sense that it hopes to preserve the status quo. Of course, unionism has gone through a whole series of changes. It would be folly to think that you could just talk about the emergence of unionism 200 years ago and pretend that it's the exact same that it is today. Though I think it is important to understand that when it was formed, it wasn't just formed because Protestants woke up and says, "Oh well, our identity is British, and we are unionists." In fact, as I'm sure most of you know, when they were fighting against the United Irishmen, the majority of the leadership were Presbyterian. I mean, you could argue essentially that republicanism was formed by radical Protestantism. So there's no natural reflection. Unionism was a movement that was formed by the elites, by the powerful, in what was then Ireland, but in Ulster, in conjunction with the mainly conservative elites in London, to maintain British rule in Ireland and to maintain the status quo. That was something, like I said, that come about not by some sort of process of natural reflection, but it was a movement that was laid out by the rich and by the powerful. But unionism today is not quite unionism of the past. In fact, it's not just the last 200 years. Unionism today is not quite the same as unionism 40 years ago or 50 years ago. Throughout the history of the northern state, unionism was essentially a one-party state. It controlled the north. It discriminated against Catholics, excluded them from the state, and was basically the hegemonic ideology. Hegemonic meaning just the dominant ideology in the country. Unionism today is not defeated by any stretch, but unionism's not what it once was. And obviously, people here will have seen over the last 5 years, maybe, the emergence constantly of this sort of angst in Belfast, whether it's riots, whether it's over parades, or whether most recently over flags. This sort of almost exertion of discontent within unionism. There's an article that I wrote in the IMR that I'm sure you can get that goes into this. But just to lay it out in broad strokes, I would argue that unionism today, far from being the steady and dominant ideology, is an ideology and a movement that is in crisis. And it's in a crisis that has a deep difficulty in getting out of. Why is that? Well, unionism as an ideology was always an all-class alliance of Protestants. So, originally it was an alliance essentially between Protestant landlords and more plebeian elements of Belfast and Antrim and so on. Then throughout the 19th and 20th century, it was mainly, a movement led by orange industrialists, capitalists, and with sections of support within the working class. But unionism as an ideology essentially put forward the idea that all Protestants have one interest, no matter whether you're a Protestant worker in the shipyards or you're the owner of the shipyard, both those people have the same interest. And therefore unionism needs to coalesce all these people into one group, into one movement, you call it what you will, in order to maintain power. But you have to ask yourself, how was unionism able to maintain a movement like that for so long? Well, they basically did it through a strategy of two things. One was through discrimination against Catholics and, you know, basically, you know, scaremongering and beating the orange drum and saying, we have to all come together, we're going to be in this popish United Ireland. And the other was this idea that if Protestant working class people stick with their unionist leaders, they will be given something. You know, here, stick with us and you can get a job, stick with us and you can get a house, stick with us and you'll at least be better off than the people across on the Falls Road. Now, first of all, that idea was never wholly true. So if you look, for instance, in the 1919, there was a huge general strike in Belfast. They win huge pay increases for the workers, particularly in the engineering sector and in the shipyards. If you actually look, this is in a period where there's working class unity. If you look 3 or 4 years later, the wages of Protestants in the shipyards after partition, so in other words, after the unionist state is formed, is about a third of that it was in 1919 before partition was created. In other words, Protestant workers were far better off when they were fighting with their Catholic brothers and sisters 3 years before than they were under the so-called Protestant state that was supposed to look after them. Not only that, but conditions for the so-called British Protestant workers in Belfast have always been far, far lower than those in, say, Liverpool or Manchester or London. In other words, yes, it was true at one point that the average Protestant worker might have been more likely to get a job than the average Catholic worker, but by and large, the entire working class lost out because of that sectarianism. The second thing is that period of unionist hegemony was never without challenge. There were periods where it's a quicker speaker than I am. And that's the movement that emerged. Republicanism of the 60s, of 69, the reason that the provisionals grew was because most of the left, most of the organisation says, what we need is reform of the northern state. We need, so, you know, the Nationalists says, well, the Nationalists said very little, they had very little of an answer. The traditions of the Communist Party, the official IRA and so on says, we need to reform the northern state. The provisional movement basically says we need to smash the northern state. And in the day-to-day of the 70s in Belfast or Derry or so on, that idea made sense. You know, we need to get rid of the British Army off the streets. We need to get rid of this discriminatory state. And republicanism grew off the back of that. But of course, republicanism was faced with a serious problem. How do you smash that state when a very large section of people in that country are supportive of that state? And how does a small, urban guerrilla army, if you like, take on and beat the British state? And of course, a very long period called the Troubles happened, where the British state attempted to smash the IRA attempted to smash the British state, and there was an impasse. The Belfast Agreement that emerged in 97-98 essentially emerges out of that impasse. The British state realises that it can't just smash the IRA, that it needs to take in a section of the Republican and nationalist community into the state. The unionist state, or at least a section of it, realises that there's no chance of going back to the exact old orange state, and that there has to be some sort of compromise with nationalism. And backed by essentially US imperialism, British imperialism, a settlement was carved out, which I would argue is a sectarian state. In other words, the old orange state was gone, and now you have a sectarian state with the Unionists and the DUP in government. Republicanism today says that it's, still for a Catholic Protestant dissent, and by this I mean Sinn Féin, that they're still for a United Ireland and so on. But they still say they're a radical organisation. But I think over certainly the last couple of weeks, that political ideology has been put under serious strain. As a bourgeois nationalist movement, republicanism can express itself very left-wing at times, can express itself as very conservative at other times, in a way that unionism really doesn't have the political language to do so. So, you don't know if people followed it in the north recently. Sinn Féin were organising a campaign against Tory cuts. So they're having stalls, stand up, fight back, all this kind of stuff. Within weeks of the campaign, they'd agreed a budget with the DUP, a very savage budget, which essentially means almost £1 billion worth of cuts. And in essence, the contradictions of republicanism is laid out. So they're for a new radical Ireland, but they don't have the means to do so. And they're not a movement which seeks to overhaul the system. I would argue that republicanism certainly may well have hoped to have a bit of a burst after the Scottish referendum, though it failed. But there seems to be very little appetite at the moment for a similar fight in the North over the same thing, as they found out at Queen's University very recently. Which essentially there was a referendum to that Queen's University should support a United Ireland, or Queen's Student Union. And Queen's these days is a majority Catholic university. But a majority of people voted for a neutral position, something which I'll come to probably in about an hour's time. The other thing that republicanism today represents that it didn't in the 1960s is what there's been a very clear emergence of is a Catholic middle class. The Malone Road, which is the richest part of Belfast, has a Catholic majority these days. And this Catholic middle class has made its peace with the state. It's no longer excluded from the state in the way it would have been in the 40s and 50s. And really is satisfied to carve out its niche for its identity, quote unquote, and so on. And Sinn Féin essentially almost sits on top of these two things. There's a big working class constituency that bore the brunt of the Troubles, that got very little out of it, that is still expecting to get something out of it. And this middle class constituency which wants to see lower corporation tax so that it can trade more freely, that wants to see inward investment and so on, which does wants the wages kept low and so on and so forth. So Sinn Féin is a movement that straddles these two class forces who have essentially two class interests. And we see this all the time. So Sinn Féin are going about at the moment saying, stop Tory cuts, though they're implementing. Sinn Féin are going about talking about the savage attacks of the Tories on the lowest paid people on benefits, yet are supporting the idea of a lower of corporation tax in half, so to cut in half the amount paid to corporations in the North, so that you can get inward investment. Those are two contradictory things. They're essentially talking out of both sides of their mouths. They're actually very good at it. But it's a movement that faces contradictions at times. Now, those are the two main movements. As I said, I was attempting to give a brief overview. But what is the prospects for building a left in the North? In other words, what is the prospects for building a working class movement in Protestant areas, in Shankill, like in the Shankill or the Falls, and nationalist areas, in Derry or so on? What are the prospects for building that movement? What is the prospects for breaking the hegemonic control of these two main ideologies in the North? I would argue that over that Jerry Carroll's election was a signal that there is serious opportunities for the left in the coming period. That a left that practically links, struggle over, whatever it may be, whether it was leisure and things like that Jerry was fighting over, with political organisation, with a fight for an alternative, can have a chance. But there are a couple of things that need to be said about that. If you want to challenge sectarianism, and if you want to challenge this movement, or the state in the North, there are other alternatives. One alternative, which I call broadly Northern Irish liberalism, is the idea that in order to move away from sectarianism, what we need to do is we need to put all our stock into supporting the Northern state, into encouraging the DUP and Sinn Féin to be nice to each other, into encouraging the Assembly to get its act together, and into encouraging people to learn from each other and so on. So, Catholics need to stop complaining about the Orange Order and so on and so forth, and, Protestants need to learn about the Irish language and so on and so forth. And that's then, someday in the glorious future we'll all sit down and exchange hurley sticks and sashes and so on and so forth. So this is the most prevalent idea in the North. Now I would say this argument, in other words, you hear it all the time, if only our politicians got our act together. You look at the flags, if only our politicians get our act together. The problem that on the streets is being caused by the politicians in the first place. In other words, the sectarianism that's going on the street is a trickle down from the sectarianism of the state. So that every time somebody says let's strengthen the northern state, they are strengthening the sectarian ideas on the ground. This is the idea that people are completely missing out on. Then in other words, every time we say we leave it to the DUP and Sinn Féin, get your act together, you're strengthening that idea that there are two communities. Not a chance. I'll get there, but not in 10 seconds. That was asking a lot. So in other words, and you see this all the time, you know, the North was well known for having a series of repressive laws, Special Powers Act, for instance. And actually, because of that notion of politics, that let's support the state, actually more and more the North is becoming repressive again. You know, I heard recently a Sinn Féin MLA and a SDLP MLA, SDLP got off lightly in that look over nationalism, proposed that if you want to organise a protest in the North, you have to be able to pay for it. You have to pay for the police operation, and you have to pay for any potential thing that happens. Now think about it. This is from two nationalist politicians. Imagine if the Unionist government had that power in 1968 and 69. Had they been able to turn around in Nicara and say, here, if you want to organise a protest, show me the money. If they'd been able to say after the riots to essentially bankrupt every member of Nicara because of the riots and so on. This is coming from nationalist politicians. It comes because of, there's a small camp called Tweddale, Loyalists, a very sectarian camp, which causes a whole lot of problems for people in North Belfast. But they use this idea of, you know, let's support the state, let's get rid of the extremes and increase repression. There's a guy in Derry called Gary Donnelly, who comes from a dissident Republican background, who's an elected councillor, who was being jailed for 6 months for not paying a fine over graffiti. Now, leaving all that aside, because of that, Gary Donnelly's now going to lose his seat. Now, of course, no one's going to say a peep because he's dissident. Oh, well, we'll just leave that. But of course, the idea now is, if you're a councillor and you step outside of the law, I mean, you would look at some of our councillors in the south now who are fighting against water charges, we'd be next. You know, we'd be losing our seat too. So again, this notion, strengthen the state, that'll strengthen the idea of challenge to sectarianism, actually leads to the opposite. But more important than any of that, I would argue that the resurgence of sectarianism over the last 4 or 5 years, in other words, the intensification of it, has been driven by the economic recession. It's been driven by unemployment. It's been driven by low wages. It's been driven by this idea that you don't have a future. That comes from the assembly. That comes from the top. So if you're trying to strengthen the assembly, you're strengthening the thing that is actually fueling the problem on the ground in the first place. People genuinely say, if only our politicians would get their act together and lower corporation tax, how in God's name is that going to challenge sectarianism? How is the idea that the rich are paying less going to challenge sectarianism in working class areas? But this is what we're faced with. The left has to have the understanding that it can't, you know, we can't just look to the state to challenge sectarianism. The state is the guarantor for sectarianism. But more to the point, we have to understand that the state fuels, and the methods of the state is what fuels the sectarianism in the first place. So we need something different. I think the left has to understand that sectarianism is the biggest obstacle to working class unity. It's not something over here that we maybe will deal with at some time in the future. It's the single biggest obstacle. One of the things we say in People for Profit in Belfast is you can ignore sectarianism, but sectarianism, I'm not saying about that, and you can sure enough do that for as long as you want, but that sectarianism won't ignore you. So, what are we on now? 10 seconds. Okay. It's a hard shirt. It's the last time okay. So I'm going to have to drop the rest. How many seconds are we on now? Okay, so I think the leftists understand that as a challenge sectarianism. But ultimately, there's only two things that can happen. If I said that when people make someone on the Shankill Road says the other side are at fault, or someone on the other side says the other side is at fault, that it can make sense to people in a convoluted way. The only reason it makes sense in a convoluted way is because there's a benign apartheid in the North. People, working class people, don't, don't see the other side. They don't understand or don't see what's going on, and so on and so forth. The only thing that changes people's experience is struggle. When working class people fight together, that is the only time that people's experience changes, that they begin to understand that the other side isn't to blame. So when you see, like for instance in 2011, there was one strike, it was a very important strike, it was very big, unfortunately it was called off by the unions. But there was a demonstration, we had people from bus workers, and we're meeting with classroom assistants and met with civil servants, and we marched down and we met with hospital workers, and then we marched down through the village and so on. You can see how in an extended movement like that, people's experience can be changed and sectarianism can be challenged. But that's a possibility, not an inevitability. In that movement, sectarian ideas still need to be challenged. In that movement, sectarian organisations need to be challenged. And we have to have a dual perspective that fights to build working class unity on the ground, that fights to build campaigns on the ground, whilst maintaining organisations that are going to challenge the sectarian ideas as well. So I'll leave it there. Sorry.